I would now like to invite our next panelist, Ms. Conora Gall. Ms. Gall is a senior foreign correspondent with the New York Times. She has completed a posting in Tunisia, reporting on North Africa and covering wide-ranging issues of jihadism, Islamic extremism, and the geopolitical influences fueling them. Prior to that, she spent more than 12 years reporting from Afghanistan and Pakistan. She led a team that received the Pulitzer Prize for the coverage of Afghanistan and Pakistan in 2009, and was awarded the Neiman Foundation Fellowship at Harvard, USA. She is the author of The Wrong Enemy, America in Afghanistan, 2001 to 2014. Thank you, Ms. Gall, for being here today.
Thank you for inviting me. Is this on, yeah?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you for the former speakers' excellent speeches. I was going to speak just on being a foreign correspondent in Pakistan and Afghanistan. I spent 10 years there for the New York Times from 2001 until 2011. And much of my time was also in Pakistan, because you can't cover Afghanistan without going to Pakistan and understanding what is driving the war there. And so I wanted to talk today about one of probably the worst experiences I had as a foreign correspondent. I've been a journalist for over 20 years. It happened in Quetta, Baluchistan, and it became a bit of a joke among us foreign correspondents that Quetta was really the danger zone rather than Afghanistan. I was in 2006 investigating, in fact, Taliban, the presence of Taliban in Quetta. They use it as their base. Many of them live there. They have their leadership meetings. And so I was knocking on doors and talking to people and finding families, members of the Taliban. And I was followed by Pakistani intelligence. I knew that we could see them, but we thought we were okay. But my last night in the hotel, my hotel room was raided and I was beaten up, and all my equipment and notebooks, telephones were seized. And my photographer was also taken and arrested. He was a local Pakistani. It was a nasty bit of intimidation. The government never apologized, but did get my belongings back. But we realized they copied everything, all the hard drive and all my notebooks, and so they followed up a lot of my sources and arrested people. They hunted down Afghans, they arrested Pakistanis, and mainly Baluch. So it was a very nasty experience and very intimidating. And what we later realized was that the aim was to intimidate, to prevent me from continuing my reporting there. But it was also a message to all foreign correspondents working in Pakistan, is that you are not welcome in Baluchistan, you have no place coming there. All the local reporters who, whether they're Pashtun or Baluch or Punjabi, who live and work in Baluchistan, were warned not to work with foreigners. And of course, foreign correspondents always use local journalists. They're the ones who know the languages, they know the people, they know the stories. They help us immeasurably in our work. And they were all warned off. And I know this because people who work with me, or even just were friends or colleagues, told me they got visits from the intelligence, or they were called in by the intelligence and told not to work with any foreigners. Even Japanese photographers who might come through. They were just, so from then onwards, this was 2006, very few foreign correspondents could go to Baluchistan and report, and this is why we have this absolute blackout on what's happening there. It's extremely difficult for us to get there. I did manage to sneak in again in 2009. Normally, if you can book a flight and fly down there, but you get followed from the moment you touch ground, and so you then find that intelligence officials disrupt your meetings or frighten anyone you want to try and see, or they follow you, so everyone else you're trying to see gets intimidated. But I managed to arrange a trip with some people in 2009, and why I wanted to go back was that the story there is obviously not only that the Taliban use it as their base, but there's a very real problem of the insurgency in Baluchistan. And just to go back a little bit, when we investigated why I got beaten up and why I got intimidated, at the time, the men who raided my room said, you're breaking the rules, you shouldn't be interviewing the Taliban here. You shouldn't be going to Pashtunabad, which is an area where a lot of the Taliban live in Quetta. But we subsequently found out that they had been particularly angered by a couple of other stories I'd written earlier in 2006, and one was about Baluchistan. And I traveled into the mountains to see Nawab Bukti, who was a famous tribal leader of the Bukti tribe, and he had this altercation with President Musharraf earlier that year, and he took to the mountains when in fact the military came to raid his tribal home in Dera Bukti, and he took to the mountains, and I went up to find him and see what it was all about, because this was a man who was, he'd been a ward of the Raj, he'd been educated in the highest schools of the land, he'd been a foreign minister, he'd been governor. This was a man who was a tribal leader, but a much respected minister and political leader. And suddenly he was hiding in the mountains and fighting Musharraf. And so anyway, I went up there, and of course they hated, the establishment as we call them in Pakistan, hated that story, which was on the front page of the New York Times. So that they also wanted to stop reporters reporting the Baluch issue. And one of them said to me, an intelligence official, you made him a hero. And they didn't want this. They didn't want to listen to the Baluch and let them have their say. They wanted to push through the military plans, the Gwadar, the whole military control of the province and so on. So this was made very clear to me. But anyway, I continued, and in 2009 I went back, and particularly because there was a very nasty case of political killings. There were 3 political activists who'd been killed, and their bodies had been dumped, riddled with bullets. So I went to just find out what was going on, and I found really things had got much worse than in 2006 when the insurgency really started. By 2009 it was a very dirty war, and people like these men who were peaceful activists, they were political, they were known to be political, but they were not fighting. They weren't involved in the armed insurgency. And they'd been picked up, snatched in daylight from their lawyer's office, and the lawyer had witnessed it all, and then they turned up dead 5 days later. And this was the beginning of a pattern which we've all seen since. It's gone on, really it spiraled into 2011. Hundreds are being killed every year. And they're mostly young journalists, students, political activists, lawyers, doctors. And there's a famous doctor that I met years ago who was extremely badly tortured to the point where he couldn't walk or talk. He was wheeled in from the prison to the prison hospital, and I interviewed witnesses who saw him. And within weeks he'd been reduced to a sort of skeleton, and he couldn't talk and he couldn't walk. And they revived him, but after a week of care he could start to talk, and then he was taken back to prison. He since was released, and of course, guess where? He's in the mountains fighting. So this is the pattern that's happened, that people are given very little choice to be active in, whether in politics or just in their communities. They're being hounded by the army and the intelligence services, and so they're often taking to the mountains as a last resort, or they're fleeing the country. And I get calls the whole time from people who fled the country or are trying to seek asylum somewhere. It's become really staggering. So it's very difficult as a foreign correspondent to write this, partly because Baluchistan is not the most important story for our editors. We've of course, as an American newspaper, written an enormous amount about Afghanistan over the years, but really only occasionally about about Balochistan. Pakistan has been a major story for us, and I've written a huge amount about it. But again, Balochistan is always an afterthought, so it's a difficult one for us to report. But I would say the access and the fear connected to it makes it extremely difficult. So politicians in Pakistan won't go on the record about what's happening to us because they fear the repercussions. And then this was the second thing I wanted to say. The journalists in Pakistan might know full well what is happening, but they are intimidated. They're stopped from working with us, but they're also stopped from writing the truth. And it works in several ways, but you'll have, and this has happened to friends of mine, Pakistani journalists, they'll be picked up, or they just disappear for a few days and nobody really knows where they are, they're out of touch. And then they come back and they're kind of slightly less ebullient, a bit more thoughtful and quiet, and they don't really want to talk about where they've been. And we all notice that they stop reporting as aggressively as they have. And it's a nasty pattern that's been going on for at least as long as I've been reporting from there, which is 2001, but I think it goes way back. They get a talking to from the intelligence services. They're sometimes tortured, they're sometimes very badly beaten up, but sometimes it's enough to say, we know the way your daughter walks to school and we know the road she has to cross and she could have an accident. You know, you need to be careful, you need to behave and not write the things you're writing. And a lot of colleagues have had that sort of talk. And they take it very seriously because a lot of them are just, you know, just journalists. We're not powerful people. And so they back down, they stop reporting things that they're warned of. There are other taboos that editors are given. They're called in. Editors get these talking lines where these are things you're not to write about, but well, this is the line you're supposed to take. It happens across Pakistan. Only on certain subjects, but the two that I covered, the Taliban, the presence of the Taliban in Pakistan and the fact that Pakistan supports the Taliban and the Baluch issue are two of the taboos that editors just don't touch. And so that's why you see also a blankness in Pakistani newspapers. There are some newspapers and you can find reports, but you'll notice that they're very spare in the details. So you will read about bodies turning up on roadsides in Balochistan, but you often don't get the full expose that such human rights abuses should bring in a vibrant democratic society. So the problem is it's the intelligence and the military that are intimidating and directing that line. Finally, I think I probably have done, but yes, finally I should mention one of the most recent and distressing events, which was some of the Baluch still try and demonstrate, and so there was a famous group that tried to do a march all the way from Quetta to Islamabad. They got very little coverage, but they walked the whole way. I can't remember how many miles it is, but it's 1,000 kilometers or whatever it is. And they got very little coverage, but they persisted, and then they tried to have talks, a bit like this, where they could explain to people their case. And people were scared off from holding events to host them. And then famously, a woman activist gave them space in Karachi and was murdered soon after. And many of us who knew her and who knew the events feel that it was directly related to her hosting the Baluch to talk about the cases of human rights abuses and disappearances, that she was killed because of her collaborating. So you can imagine how chilling that is to anyone else who might think of doing a hearing or speaking out. So it's a very grim war, it's a very dirty war, but it's also very, very hard to report. And so I just wanted to come and say that's my experience, and that's really how it is. Okay.